Okay, looking at the time, and obviously this is a shorter kind of bite-sized session, and recognizing that it is your lunchtime, I think it's a good time to get going. So together we can start demystifying the Equality Act 2010 and discussing what you need to know. My name is Roxanne Steele, and I work for Diversity and Ability. For those who may not know, Diversity and Ability is a multi-award-winning social enterprise led by and for disabled people. The reason I believe we are multi-award-winning is we're truly driven by authentic lived experiences, and this includes mine as a facilitator and yours as a participant. Our drive and our mission is to support the creation of diverse and inclusive cultures. As I said, I am Roxanne Steele. I work as an accessibility and inclusion lead within our delivery team. My pronouns are they, she, but don't worry if you get those wrong, they're just preferred. I am a white presenting person with short black dyed hair, and today I have purple makeup on and a very flowery top because I'm trying to hold on to the heat and hold on to summer. As an accessibility and inclusion lead, I am passionate about creating spaces that we can discuss and facilitate discussions around inclusion. I come from a place of lived experience of physical difference, mental health challenges, and neurodiversity. I would love to get to know each and every one of you, but unfortunately, this is a webinar format. So do feel free to connect with me and reach out and discuss with me more about why you're here and how we can support you via my LinkedIn. You'll find a QR code on the screen. I think that's enough from me. The session. Before we start, because we are in a webinar format, your microphones will automatically be muted. This doesn't mean that we don't want you to contribute today. You can add your questions into the chat box, and I want to remind you there are no silly questions at all, and hopefully that counts for me as a facilitator as well as you as a participant. We're all learning and we're all on different spaces within our journey, but what we want to create today is that safe, open and inclusive learning space for everyone. So what are we going to discuss in this our lunch and learn? We're going to give you an overview of the Equality Act 2010. Then we're going to invite you into a myth-busting quiz where we're going to demystify the Equality Act and really understand what we may not know. Then we're going to have a look at the language and the law pertaining to the Equality Act, as well as exploring the action with a case study. And we're going to leave you with some practical tools and tips before providing you space for questions and reflections. Right, let's dive in. So, as I said at the beginning, we want this to be a collaborative session. So we have enabled a Slido quiz. You can join us via the QR code that you may see on the left-hand side of your screen, or you can use the long form link to join us at slido.com. And to join the questions and the room, you can use code number 2913880, where the first question should come up for you. How familiar are you with the Equality Act on a scale of 1 to 5? Now, don't worry, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just great to see how confident and where we are within the room. So I can see a lot of people engaging with that already. Quite high levels of confidence, with 33% of the room saying 4 stars. Thank you, Lilith, for sharing that long form link. and the room code. Thank you, Lilith. So 35% of the room feel that they are around a number 4 when it comes to how familiar you are with the Equality Act, which is great to see a range of knowledge here today. If we just pop on to the next question. Thank you, Bridget. I'd love to hear from you. One thing that you'd like to learn today. So there should be a Slido option for you to share one key thing you would like to learn today. Something new. That sounds like a challenge, and hopefully I can rise to that. Colin, you're having some challenges using Slido. No problem at all. If you'd like to contribute anything, please do feel free to use the chat. If you'd like to contribute something anonymously, please do direct message diversity and ability within the room. So we've got some great things. We want everything. I don't know if I'm going to be able to cover everything in a lunch and learn, but that is definitely a challenge. Any recent developments, how to implement it best I can, how people understood that adjustments are about the impact on the individual and not the proof or evidence. I'm new in my role. Oh, there's loads of responses here. So really great to see people contributing. What else you can be doing? People's experiences in the law. So some really great things. I'm going to move on, but that Slido poll will still be open, and please do feel free to contribute. And hopefully we can bring some of those things out in today's session. So I think before we can demystify it, it's important that we have a good overview of the Equality Act. The Equality Act 2010 unifies over 100 anti-discriminatory laws in an aim to create a simpler, stronger legal framework. And there's a key focus on protection from discrimination, whether that be direct or indirect, harassment, victimization. And this is both in the workplace and as part of your public life. So this will also include products and services that you are receiving and organizations that you interact with. And under the Equality Act, it ensures or hopes to ensure that these actions are taken in an anticipatory way. What does that mean? Well, quite simply, it's not waiting for me to highlight or engage with your services. It's about imagining all the diversity that's in the world that may engage with your services or products and anticipating any barriers they may face to your services and trying to remove them before they become a barrier for that individual. So it's all about recognizing, forecasting, and moving forward and taking the onus away from the individual that may face discrimination. But next, I'm going to give you a little break from my voice just for a few moments, where we're going to have a look at a video that summarizes the Equality Act and actually looks more deeply into the effects, particularly around disability and what our responsibilities are.
In this quick summary video, we're going to talk about the Equality Act 2010 and what this means for you and your workplace. The Equality Act came into force on the 1st of October 2010, and it brought together over 116 pieces of legislation that included the Equal Pay Act, the Equality Regulations, the Race Relations, Employment Law, and importantly for this video, the Disability Discrimination Act. The Equality Act is intended to protect individuals from discrimination from the protected characteristics in the workplace. It's very important to note that being a disabled person is a protected characteristic, and this means that a disabled person should not be discriminated against on grounds of their diversity. So what does this mean for you and your organisation? Well, this is a legal requirement that requires you to ensure your workplace is inclusive and accessible. This may mean you need to make changes to ensure disabled people aren't treated unfavourably due to their diversity. How can I uphold the Act in the workplace? Here are a few suggestions. Ensure your policies and practices don't present barriers in the way that they're written and their intended outcomes. Remove the physical features that limit access. Or provide reasonable assistive technology and services such as BSL interpretation or a hearing loop. These changes are what's known as reasonable adjustments. Often, there is a belief that inclusive changes are costly and expensive and only support one person. Mythbuster, making inclusive changes for one person can actually support many people, and many adjustments are actually made at no or low cost. Here's an example of inclusive practice. To ensure everyone can access company communications, this organisation records its handbook onto audio CDs for individuals with visual impairments and sends out newsletters as an audio file where required. What is meant by anticipatory duty? Well, the Equality Act 2010 is an anticipatory duty, which means there's an expectation that an organisation will make reasonable adjustments and can't wait until a disabled person is employed or uses their services. This means you need to think in advance about what adjustments might be needed. Not only is this a legal duty, it also makes good business sense. By embracing the anticipatory approach and welcome in your organisation, you will attract and retain a diverse pool of talent.
Thank you very much, Meg. Hopefully that's given us a real good overview and particularly starting to think about the Equality Act and its impact around disability. But as we go through this session, I really want you to hold these two key kind of phrases in our minds. Protected characteristics. These are 9 protected characteristics that have been chosen due to historical disadvantages that these marginalized groups may have faced. And why have we chosen these? These are based on prior laws, and these align with international human rights principles. When we talk about reasonable adjustments, here at DNA, we want you to go beyond the physical access needs. So it's beyond the physical space and think intersectionally by using those protected characteristics to think about what barriers people may be facing. Because if we don't truly remove all barriers, are we removing any barriers at all? With the Equality Act, we have found in the past that actually people are finding it challenging or have found it challenging to have a case viewed in an intersectional way. And instead, people, when they do find justice, are actually getting recognised only under one characteristic. However, this is improving and more cases are being seen under an intersectional lens, which helps us acknowledge systematic barriers and systematic discrimination someone may face through having multiple characteristics. For example, me as a disabled white person may be facing less barriers or discrimination when being in a medical space, as there are misunderstandings around race and how that can impact our own medical journeys. A great example of this case for those who really like case law and may want to look into this further is D'Souza versus Da Vinci's construction. So I would love to go through that in more detail, but as I say, unfortunately we have an hour. But for those who may be interested in looking at case law, actually this is a great example where the courts are starting to recognise and reward based on an intersectional basis. Thank you for adding that, Bridget. But now I would like to invite you to collaborate with our session. Jump back on Slido and let's start to bust some myths together today. Apologies about my cough. I am just getting over a cold, so I do apologise if that has caused any delay in my speech. So we'd like you to join us for this true or false quiz, where we're going to have a look at some common misconceptions or potential misconceptions. And the first question we have is, under the Equality Act, employees must disclose their disability to their employer to be protected from discrimination. Do we think that's true, or do we think that's false? Absolutely, do feel free to pop those answers in the chat if Slido isn't working for you. As I say, hopefully this is just a bit of a fun quiz to keep us engaged in today's session and really kind of reflect on what we think we know. So 15% of the room currently thinks that's true, that someone needs to disclose their disability to be protected from discrimination, where 85% of the room think that is currently false. So let's see if we can bust this myth. So the 15% of the room are correct. You do not have to disclose a disability or indeed another protected characteristic to be protected under the Equality Act. The Equality Act protects employers regardless of whether they disclose a disability or not. Employers are expected to make reasonable adjustments if they are aware or should be reasonably aware of a disabling experience or disability within the space. Got our next question today. True or false? The Equality Act protects people from discrimination based on perceived characteristics, even if they don't have that characteristic. Do we think that is true, or do we think that is false today? How's the room feeling about this one? At the moment, we're going 100% true, but I'm going to give you a few moments. The vote has closed. That's fine. If we could move on the slide, unless there is a technical problem there, Bridget. Yes, that is correct. The Equality Act protects people from discrimination based on perceived characteristics, even if they don't have them. The 100% of the room that engaged with that got that right. So the Act protects individuals from perceived characteristics. So it doesn't matter whether I have a disability, it's whether someone perceives and has ultimately discriminated, potentially victimized, or harassed me due to a perceived protected characteristic or lived experience that they may think I have. And our final question today. True or false, the Equality Act requires all workplaces to be fully accessible regardless of the nature of the business. And we've got true or false again. Oh, this one's quite an even-ish split, with 56% of the room thinking it might be true, with 44% of the room thinking it may be false. So this is a real one to bust. So let's see. Or are people still responding? Just give you a few moments. So the correct answer is false. So 44% of the room got that correct. So the myth is the Equality Act requires all workplaces to be fully accessible. That's actually false. Workplaces must make reasonable adjustments to remove barriers, yes, but it does depend on the nature and the resources of the business on what the expectation of reasonable adjustments looks like. For example, Bob's Corner Shop that has some steps going up to the corner shop may not be expected to put in a lift that allows you at the start to get in that way, but somewhere like Harrods might, although we may expect them to put like an auxiliary ramp or a temporary ramp, or even give you an alternative way to get into the building, say maybe there is potentially a back door. Obviously, that brings up questions around experience and customer service, but it's reasonable that they have created space for you to be able to enter that establishment. So let's have a look at the language and how it pertains to the law. When we look at the Equality Act, and particularly around defining disability, this is the current language that we have. Under the Equality Act, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that has substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So this again bringing up those key phrases: physical or mental impairment, substantial, long-term, day-to-day activity. How are people feeling about that language that we currently have? Do you feel free to put any reflections or in the chat, or give us a reaction using Zoom? It would be great to see if anyone has any reflections on that language. Just give you a few moments in case anyone would like to reflect. But what I notice here, and something we reflect a lot on at DNA, is the language used around disability and how it focuses on very much the medicalized terms, someone having a physical, mental impairment. So thinking about how that might lead people to think, I need to be diagnosed to be able to get support or ask reasonable adjustments. Again, it gets people to look at disability in the lens of being unable to potentially participate due to a challenge they bring, rather than the social model of creating spaces. But actually, this is the language that we currently have. And thinking around language like substantial, what does substantial mean to a lot of people, and how that can ultimately be interpreted. Long term is obviously something that may affect your day-to-day life for more than 12 months, and obviously day-to-day activities that can be quite open and broad. So again, we hope people perceive it and obviously interact with it in the most enabling way, to look at the most activities and how people are interacting with the world. But it is down to people's perceptions, and I think that myth busting element of what we have to do and what reasonable adjustments actually look like, because I think a lot of people may worry and again think that it's expensive, it's knocking down walls, but actually this isn't the case. Yes, normal is very, very tricky. Because what is normal, who is normal, and we do want to move away from that language as a disabled society in particular. But actually, at the moment, this is the language that we have to obviously reflect, and especially when we are trying to gain justice as well. So that is a very kind of problematic and I think brings up a lot of conversations and reflections for me in sessions. But obviously, if anyone does want to discuss language and how that can impact the way that we support disability in another session or in another space, that is something that I am very passionate to do. So hopefully we'll be able to reach out and have further discussions. But I'm going to move on and have a look at reasonable adjustments. So, but what are reasonable adjustments? A reasonable adjustment simply meaning an adaptation that removes barriers to working. Now, this can be a change in the workspace, a change to how things are done, or even a person to support you at an interview or at work, or indeed your educational organisation. A reasonable adjustment or change to the workplace, I know I keep saying it, does not necessarily mean knocking down those walls or creating more rooms, but thinking about what we can currently do within our workspaces to change that environment and potentially remove barriers. So thinking about people that might face challenges with barriers to vision, sensitivity to light. So, for example, it's not about changing the space or building a bigger space. Can we look at how an office or an educational workspace is set up for someone? So, if someone does find that natural light is more supportive, is there a workspace towards a window, for example, that they can control or adapt? Or can we offer, for example, individualized lighting for someone to control themselves? And even thinking about, say, someone's proximity to maybe a very noisy phone bank or computer desk, and whether this could be moved so an individual does not have to face barriers when it comes to communication or sensory challenges. A change to how things are done can just simply be a conversation. For example, does all our information have to be sent out via email? Do we have to write all this down in large documents, or can these conversations and communications be done via voice notes, via a meeting, for example? Can this be followed up with notes to help someone? Or is there a way that we can actually embed the importance of providing reasonable adjustments over and above diagnosis within our policies? And what we can do is, for anyone that's thinking about how we can actually make our policies more inclusive, more enabling for people to be able to recognise that they have access to reasonable adjustments, that is something that we can support you with. And of course, there is the last point here where we talk about how someone can benefit from personal or human support. Now, this does not mean that a workplace or an educational organisation needs to potentially fund or provide that work person or person to work with. Actually, there are organisations and funds such as the Disability Students Allowance and Access to Work that allows us to do this and provides that funding, taking the onus away from you as an organisation. What we'd ask here is that the organisation has a policy, has a procedure, is comfortable to provide that space that allows someone to bring that person to be able to support them either in an interview or while they're working. And these are just a few examples of what reasonable adjustments mean. I think the most important thing I would take away from this is what is reasonable is definitely still a debate in the language we use, and it's important to remember that not the same adjustment will support everyone. So if you've met one person that uses a wheelchair, like myself, and may need support from a PA at work, it doesn't mean that someone else in a wheelchair will need to have the same support. So what's really important is that collaboration and that confidence to have that conversation with everyone. So not just identifying someone that has a disability or another protected characteristic, but simply creating spaces where we ask everyone, how could you best do your job? What can we put in place to help you thrive? So hopefully that section's been helpful. Now I would love to take you into a case study so we can explore what the Act looks like in action and maybe discuss how we as an organisation, as an individual, would look at this case and what we would do differently next time. So we're going to have a look at Frank Gardner and the BBC. I would like you to reflect as we're going through what could be done differently and think about the people involved, think about the practices that could be put in place, and even the policies that could be in place to help with this. So I don't know if anyone's heard of this case before. Apologies if you have and you were the person looking for something new, but I think this is a particularly interesting case as well, taking into consideration that they are currently the BBC also. So Frank Gardner is a wheelchair user that you may be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. They're sat in a manual wheelchair with their legs crossed, wearing a suit, and they're a white presenting person. What happened to Frank? Frank was stranded outside of the BBC due to a malfunctioning lift, which actually caused him to miss a live broadcast that he was meant to be involved in. So what was the outcome here? What actually happened? The BBC issued a public apology and committed to improving accessibility under the Equality Act. That was the outcome, that a public apology and a commitment was made to Frank and to other individuals following this. So I'd like you to think, what could the BBC have done differently to ensure Frank's access needs were met? Because this was a malfunctioning lift. So obviously these things do happen, and we're not saying like never have a lift that's out of action, because that is beyond our control. But the fact that one lift went down, this actually impacted someone from doing their job. So what could we put in place as an anticipatory measure to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Have more than one lift, alternative access, so maybe in an alternative route, have more than one entrance, location of broadcasting room on the ground floor, alternative access, let him know the lift was out of order and provide other accessible ways in case this happens again. Having assessments done for possible malfunction, prioritize fixing lifts, flexibility around broadcasting, remote broadcasting. So again, we're really thinking about that flexibility and the location. But how could policy, particularly thinking about our policies, help with that? I think it's about having a process, isn't it? Thinking about how we can confidently create those reasonable adjustments. And I think one thing I would say is, obviously, I don't know the time that would have elapsed and would have been available to Frank, but actually have Frank involved in that conversation and say, we may not be in a place to be able to fix the lift at the moment, even though I think it would be quite reasonable for the BBC to be able to do that. But if we can't do that, what are the other things that we can do? So again, collaborating with Frank about what works for them is really important. For example, obviously I don't want to make assumptions because I don't know, but Frank may be an ambulatory wheelchair user that, if he had enough time, could actually, for example, have gotten up the stairs. But again, you're not meant to know that as employers, as organizations, as stakeholders in that organization. It's about asking the individual what would work for them. So thank you. So hopefully that's kind of got us thinking about what could possibly happen and things around what we can actually do when these things happen, because things happen and they can't be avoided sometimes, but it's about feeling confident in how to act and how to move forward and how to actually involve that lived experience, not only to make sure it doesn't impact the individual in that moment, but actually how that can inform policies and practices going forward. So I want to leave you with some really practical tools and tips. So as an organisation, how can we best uphold the Equality Act? It's really important to take the time to understand legal obligations. Sorry, I can't get my lips around that word today. And by you being here as an example is doing that. You are doing this inclusive action by taking steps to understand your legal obligations. But it's also important, even for the people that may not be key high-level leader stakeholders, to understand legal obligations from this high level, but to make sure that all the people that interact with us, that we work with, that we go to educational spaces with, also understand legal obligations and what that means in a simple and clear way. Not only to make sure that obviously you don't face any distractions or don't face any challenges, but actually so that people feel enabled to come to you and say, I'm facing a challenge as well. So again, I think a lot of what I've said today, I know it might be repetitive, but I think it's really important, is confidence and collaboration. So making sure that everyone is aware and confident of the obligations and how the legal framework can support you. Create spaces to make reasonable adjustments, and think about this in an anticipatory way. Reasonable adjustments are so important and so enabling to a lot of individuals, beyond someone that maybe has a diagnosis of a disability, but actually for anyone that may be facing barriers. One of my biggest tips when it comes to creating policies around reasonable adjustments is remove the need for medical diagnosis or proof, because surely if we create spaces where everyone is enabled to engage to their best skill level, actually you're going to have more engagement with your organization. Speak to individuals when they engage with your organizations, whether that be through obtaining a service, through employment, or engaging on their educational journey with you, and asking how best can we help you thrive. And actually, Bridget, I don't know if I'm throwing this to you without prior notice, but we at DNA have an access passport, which I will see if Bridget can put into the chat. This access passport is a digital passport that you can share with individuals that may be interacting with your organizations, and they're able to fill out and share as much detail as they want as possible around how they best work and what supports them. And the great thing about the access passport is it's intersectional. It goes beyond the physical access barriers. It allows us to talk about not only our communication barriers, our information barriers, but also childcare, gender health challenges people may face, and religious observances, for example. I think what's really important about access and reasonable adjustments, again, just to go back around intersectionality, if we're not looking at the whole of someone's experience, then are we truly removing barriers at all? And the great thing about the Access Passport, not only for the individuals, that I can download it for free right now and send it to my manager, for example, absolutely for free. I have complete control in that. It's not a dusty piece of paper that gets put in a filing cabinet, never looked at again. It helps me keep in control. I can remove that access and I can change my requirements at any time, because reasonable adjustments can change periodically over time. Even reasonable adjustments we may need in the morning may change to the afternoon. So it really gives us control and security around sharing our access needs, and having that as standard and asking everyone if they would like to share their access needs, because it's important that it's voluntary and obviously not mandatory. It really talks about creating a space where everyone can thrive in that anticipatory way, and it helps start that conversation. And for you as an organization, there's some really great tools that come with the Access Passport, including a dashboard that highlights the number of adjustments being requested. It also highlights patterns and trends within those adjustments, and also it can highlight what adjustments are being requested but you're not able to fulfill at the moment. So actually it helps your action plan look forward and be anticipatory. Our next top tip is fostering an inclusive culture. Sorry, if we just go back for a moment. Fostering that inclusive culture and having conversations around reasonable adjustments is just the start. As I said before, a lot of it is around thinking about how can we do stuff differently. So if we create a space where we welcome and anticipate people, for example, by asking everyone straight away, how can I best help you to thrive, then actually that creates open welcome and starts the conversation. But there's so much more that we can do to create that inclusive culture. And I wish I had more time today to take you through some stuff. But hopefully this is the beginning of your journey with DNA. If you haven't met us before, and please do contact us and we can talk through how we can help you take further steps in creating that inclusive culture beyond the Equality Act, so beyond compliance, and the fact that it's just good for business. We recommend, as part of fostering inclusive culture, though, to review your policies regularly. Think about, does it highlight, does it welcome inclusivity and accessibility? How does that language make you feel? When we reflected on language earlier and we saw the use of normal, for example. And actually, if you've never reviewed a policy through an inclusive lens, or you're not sure how to do that, do get in touch. It is one of my favorite things to do. I love discussing how policy, even though it can feel a bit dry sometimes, when we discuss things, how policy can actually be a living, enabling document for all individuals. And most importantly, I should have put this at the top, I think, for my own experiences as an accessibility lead, is to provide accessible complaint procedures. Because one of the top comments I would say that I get from a lot of organizations is, thank you for telling us and thank you for reflecting and reviewing our policies, but we've never really had anyone complain about our website not working, or say that they weren't able to apply for a job, or even highlight any challenges. And I say, okay, how are people being invited to communicate that there are challenges? Is it clear? Is it accessible? Is there multiple ways to do that? So providing an accessible complaint procedure could even be being able to offer a phone number, being able to offer an email address, making sure the systems we use, if we're using a system, is accessible via a screen reader, or simply inviting someone to contact you and you can get back to them and maybe even have a discussion in person. These are just a few things that you can do as an organisation. But what can I do as an individual to help organisations uphold the Equality Act, but more importantly, make sure that I am being protected as an individual under the Equality Act? Quite simply, knowing your rights. I know that this was a very bite-sized session, and when we went through those myth-busting questions, the rooms were quite split. So I think it's really important to take the time to discuss what we don't know, and be quite open about what we potentially don't know, because these things are always changing. And I think especially with the rise of online and people sharing information, obviously with good intention, unfortunately, there is still a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding. So again, you've taken a step already today. So you've taken one of the steps to begin to know your rights. How else can you uphold it? Request reasonable adjustments. As I say, actually utilize your rights, feel confident, and remember that organisation has a responsibility to you. Be accountable and hold others accountable. If you've discussed and agreed reasonable adjustments and they haven't been put in place, think about requesting a robust timeline and clear next steps. Checking in, feel confident that you have a right to hold individuals accountable. I know it can be hard, and I know it can feel challenging, but do report discrimination. even if you're not sure if it's made you feel this way, it's more about the impact rather than the intent. Because obviously, I think one of the most important things to remember, we don't intend to discriminate most of the time. Most people don't intend to discriminate. So actually, do report it, because a lot of organizations will want to know. And as I said before, one of the key questions or points I hear is, well, we've never had a complaint, we've never heard this. Report it, because people want to know, and engage with inclusive practices that are in place. Recognize, amplify to your colleagues, to the people that you go to university with. Celebrate that you went to this lunch and learn today, and engage with those inclusive practices and feel confident and enabled to do so. So I have spoken a lot, and so I'd really love to hear from you if you have any questions before we close today's session. Bridget, have we had any questions in the chat? Jack says, thank you. Adrian, you described the photo of Jack Gardner, and that was interesting. Is there a particular style guide you follow for this? I presume it's to aid people with visual disabilities. Absolutely. So there are some really great resources around creating image descriptions on our website, but that's in relation to obviously creating alt text for pictures that you may put online or in documents. I would use that as a real springboard to follow. But what I would say with visual descriptions, take an opportunity. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about how we want to convey and what impact you wanted audiences to take from that image. So the way that you can describe it can be different depending on, the tone of a session, the tone of the picture, the tone of the image. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's what would I want people to take from this picture if they were unable to see it right now? What are the key points? And when describing people, one tip I would give you is, unless you know, for example, that they present as male or female, or they present as white, for example, don't make assumptions. Do I have any advice to start conversations about reasonable adjustments with your employer? Thank you for sharing that. I understand it can be quite challenging. What I would say, because obviously I don't know what organization you work for and the procedures they have in place, I would have a look to see if they have any current policies around reasonable adjustments and how they currently like to discuss reasonable adjustments. Alternatively, if you feel more confident to do so, if there are spaces, this is a way that you can amplify reasonable adjustments. For example, you don't have to say for yourself, but you could ask in a team meeting, actually, we had a colleague that wanted reasonable adjustments or could benefit from. How could we start those conversations? Because if you're asking this question now, you might find that other colleagues are doing the same. Also, think about downloading the Access Passport and sharing it with, for example, your manager. That may start a conversation, because you could say, I found this app and I'm trialing it, and I'd like to share this with you. And that could help start the conversation. And again, remember, you can take that Access Passport back at any time if you share that with your manager. I hope that helped. Bridget, do we have any other questions in the chat?
We've just got one other question from Alison saying, are there any best practice materials for university lecturers to support inclusivity?
I believe that we can send some resources around that after the session. Can we, Bridget?
Yeah, we absolutely can. We'll share some good resources for you, Alison. I'm sure we've got some good ones tucked away.
Thank you, Lee. I also saw Lee sharing a resource around NAPD in the chat, so thank you. And I would really like to thank you for your time. I would have loved to have seen your faces and have longer conversations around this, but I really thank you for your commitment and engagement. And if you enjoyed this session, we'd love to see you next time. You can join us by grabbing the QR code on the screen now for the next one in January, which is competency and inclusion, redefining what matters on the 23rd of January, as well as personal emergency evacuations and disabled persons inclusion and introduction on the 20th of February, again at lunchtime, as these are lunch and learns. But if you'd like to give us some feedback or get in touch with us after the session, we'd really love that. So do feel free to contact us through the contacts on the screen, and do snap the QR code on the screen to give us some feedback for today so that you can help collaborate and contribute to our content going forward.